Joy?
Yeah, I can relate to having a cold. I have a negative COVID test and a slight cold as well. So I understand not feeling well. And, you know, obviously Joe Biden comes in with certain deficits. He has a stutter. You know, it is more difficult for him to communicate for that reason. So there's a lot to mitigate the way that he speaks, and you can understand it. And we've observed him for a long time. That said, I, too, was on the phone throughout much of the debate with Obama world people, with Democrats, with people who are political operatives, with campaign operatives. My phone really never stopped buzzing throughout. And the universal reaction was somewhere approaching panic. The people who were texting with me were very concerned about President Biden seeming extremely feeble, seeming extremely weak. And you know, I'll just reiterate what I said earlier. President Biden had one job tonight, and it was one primary job. And yes, it was to litigate Donald Trump's, you know, criminality and all of those things. But he had to settle his own party. He needed to settle Democrats. Democrats, you know, they always talk about Democrats are bedwetters and Democrats are always panicking. Yes, Democrats are always panicking. They're always scared, right? They're always thinking they're going to lose. Like, Democrats are very pessimistic. This is just
neurotic.
Who they are. They're neurotic. But Joe Biden's job was to reassure them tonight. His job was to calm his party, to make them feel that, yes, I can do this. I have 4 more years in me. I have the ability and the stamina and the strength to do 4 more years. He did not do that. He did the opposite of that. He made them more panicked. The people who were texting me were even more panicked. They actually expected it to be better than it was. And now they're in I won't say a full-fledged panic, but it's getting there.
And are people that you're talking to who are expressing these concerns, are these people who are involved in Democratic politics, or are these liberals watching TV?
This is not liberals watching TV. These are campaign people. These are people who are either Democratic operatives. These are people who are former, you know, sort of Obama world administration people. These are people who are in the business. Okay. So the civilians are also panicking. They're also texting me, but I was trying to kind of ignore the civilians and really talk to the campaign folks. People are, they're worried, and there is, you know, it's not a full drumbeat yet, but there is talk of, look, here's the thing. I know a lot of politicians. I just happen to know a lot of them at a lot of levels. They all believe that they have a unique ability to run the race that they passionately want to run. And I know for a fact that Joe Biden passionately believes that he is the only person who can beat Donald Trump, and he has evidence of it because he did it before. Right. He knows that he has certain demographic strengths that Donald Trump cannot counter. He is the real working class white guy that's actually Donald Trump's base, so he knows how to talk to them. He believes that he is the only person that can do it. The problem is, after tonight, his party doesn't believe that.
I want to hear from Lawrence and Chris as well. I first want to go to our colleague Alex Wagner, who is on site in Atlanta. She has been watching the debate in the spin room. Alex, what's the reaction that you've been hearing there?
I'm not going to put a fine sheen on it or a spin on it, even though I'm in the spin room, Rachel. There has been a uniformly negative reaction to Biden's performance tonight. Surely, as you know, Joy said, this was about revealing who Donald Trump was, but it was also Joe Biden battling a caricature of himself as an enfeebled person, an impression that Trump has been eager to convey to the country. And he did nothing to disabuse, I think, the country of the notion that he is very old and was lost frequently in that debate. I mean, on answers that should have been, to put it bluntly, a layup for him, whether it was abortion or the attack on abortion medication. His answers were rambling and incoherent. He turned a response on abortion into a mention of migrant killing. I mean, this is a person that clearly was over-prepared and had a lot of different points that were sort of swimming around in his head. And as a result, it felt like the answers that were legible, if you will, were not nearly delivered with the force and the clarity that they should have been. And I will say Donald Trump was in some ways the most Trumpy he has been lately, full of lies and misinformation. But it was almost an afterthought. I think that the press that I've spoken with and the sort of the focus in this room is just, the Biden campaign wanted this debate. This was their idea. And this is what happened as part of their strategy. It is confounding. We were told earlier this evening that the Biden spin team would be only making brief remarks in the room. And I don't know whether that is indicative of a group of people who who understood the weaknesses that their candidate had in advance of this debate. But you can surely understand the logic of that after the fact.
Alex, we've just had confirmation just while we have been speaking with you just this moment that in just a moment we're going to have Vice President Kamala Harris joining us live. So that's going to happen here just within a matter of moments. Lawrence, I also want to get your response. I think one of the interesting things that Alex said there was that some of the poor coherence and poor answers from Donald Trump are being viewed as standard Trump and therefore not newsworthy, while the performance from President Biden is being viewed as newsworthy because it came in below expectations.
Yeah, in any sort of normal universe, you would think the candidate who during the presidential debate said, "I didn't have sex with a porn star," was the loser of that debate. That would be the normal scorecard. So let's just remember that so far, the only thing we've been concentrating on here is optics, that thing we call optics, and in this case also audio because of the aging voice of Joe Biden. But the question is that we don't know the answer to is voters out there who went into this debate thinking they're for Biden or they're for Trump or thinking whatever they were thinking. What in this debate of substance that was true, if anything, moved their vote? So if you really wanted to look at it in terms of what is it supposed to be, it's supposed to be an illuminating forum in which you learn something about a candidate that you didn't know before that is true, not that you learn a lie from the candidate. That's not what the objective is. But given that the optics is the way the game is played, what we don't yet know, and we'll know in polling a week from now or so, is what was the effect of all of this? What was the effect of the guy who said, I did not have sex with the porn star? What was the effect of the convicted criminal candidate pointing to the other candidate and calling him a criminal? What is the effect of all of that back and forth? And I think we're guessing about what the effect is of the realization that Joe Biden is actually as old as his birth certificate says he is. His voice is that old, too, but he's 10 years younger than Warren Buffett. And both of them have a job that is essentially making decisions. And what was not shown to me in a way that was true in that debate is that Joe Biden has made bad decisions in the presidency. I don't see the set of bad decisions. And what was done in the Biden presidency was certainly underdeveloped in a debate where you never heard the word infrastructure, for example. Like, it was pretty underdeveloped as this went on. And that has a lot to do with the nature of the rules of these debates.
I think what you just put your finger on to me is sort of the whole issue around where we find ourselves. The job of the president is making decisions. The job of a presidential candidate is to communicate. It just is. That's the job. It's a communications job. It is talking to people and communicating them, persuading them, trying to get people who don't agree with you. And I think Joe Biden has a very good record on making decisions, and I think he's a very poor communicator right now. And that inability to communicate, I mean, I see this all the time. We will cover things on our show all the time. This big OPEC oil trade they did, where they bought high, they bought oil very cheap and then they sold very high. They made all this money. They kind of broke the back of OPEC. And people say, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. That's cool. Joe Biden should be the person communicating that. Joe Biden is not good at communicating his own record. And in the context of a campaign right now, his job, number one, is communicating. So that, and I don't disagree with you. I mean, I think you're right about the decision making. But I think the reason that there is all this, anxiety and all this stuff is because ultimately, and particularly in the television age, a lot of the presidency is communicating, but particularly when you're running for re-election, when it is the thing that is the most important thing.
But there's another job of the and this is even pre the television era. There's a reason that FDR was never shown in his wheelchair. There's a reason that John F. Kennedy pretended to be a vigorous man when he was certainly not. And Kennedy accelerated it, and I think Reagan super accelerated it because he was an actor and he was a Hollywood figure. And it's only gotten more intense until we got to President Obama, who became popular partly because rap artists were taking his speeches and turning them into hit music video. It's accelerated, but it was even true during the Roosevelt era. The president is an avatar for the American people.
Right.
And the American people have a very high opinion of themselves. The American people think of themselves, this country invented the concept of the superhero for a reason. Because the American people think we're Captain America. They think we're strong, they think we're robust, and they want their president to look that way. If William Howard Taft had lived in an era where they saw pictures of the president, he wouldn't have been the president. Americans want the president to represent them in the world in a certain way that has vigor, that has strength. Al Gore was a brilliant man, an excellent decision maker, made excellent decisions as vice president. Americans didn't care. They wanted the guy they thought was cooler. That's just real talk about Americans and about American voters. And so to your point, Joe Biden, yes, you can look at his record, and it is factually one of the best records of any modern president. It is a top 10 president's record. But you can't become president again when America looks at you and that avatar to them looks broken.
Well, let's not pretend this is a good thing.
Right.
Let's just remember that what's happened here is imagery has taken control of the way we see presidential campaigns.
Yes.
FDR could not possibly have survived a debate like this at any time, and he was arguably our best president. Could not possibly have done it. He was in much worse physical shape in his last presidential campaign, and was in effect much older, because he turns out he was in the last year of his life in his last presidential campaign, which he won. But we don't have a better government because we've turned to the most superficial components of politics to decide our candidates. If we did that in the 1940s, FDR would not have been president, and, good luck with World War II.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.